fateful day of September 8, 2023, under a beautiful blue sky, I started my first 100-kilometer ultramarathon in the alpine town of Finot in the canton of Valais in Switzerland. 25 hours later, I found out that I didn't know what trail running could be. The SwissPeaks 100 race course takes you from the small town of Finot at an altitude of 1,238 meters to the small town on the southern side of Lake Geneva, Bouvray, at 372 meters. The highest point comes just over 20 kilometers into the race at 2,493 meters, Col de Soussanve. Although this was my first 100-kilometer attempt, just looking at the profile charts provided by the organizers, a total elevation gain of around 6,000 meters didn't strike me as terribly difficult. After all, I finished a 85k race with over 4,000 meters of elevation gain in 13 hours and 2 minutes. Before coming to Switzerland, having taken into account the technical terrain, my optimistic estimate was that I could finish in 18 hours. My pessimistic estimate was within 20 hours. And I was so confident in myself that I planned my Thailand trip right after the race, based on the 20 hours estimate, and how wrong I was.
Merci à tous en tout cas de votre présence, votre confiance. Éclatez-vous, levez les yeux et passez la plus belle des journées qui soit. On se voit tous à l'arrivée en forme au Bouvray.
Tout est prêt pour le départ de la course. Nous sommes à 30 secondes du départ ou presque. On va vous donner 30 secondes, c'est ça. 30 secondes. On s'approche. On fait le décompte tous ensemble. Je demande encore une fois de lever les bras vers le ciel tous ensemble. Vous les tenez ces bras dans le ciel. Et on fera le décompte avec les bras dans le ciel bleu. Et ces montagnes magnifiques. On tient les bras pour 30 secondes. Hein. Ça c'est faisable. Plus ça devient. On tient les bras dans le ciel. Vous êtes magnifiques vu d'ici. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, go! Bon départ, bonne route, merci!
In the end, I finished in 25 hours and 20 minutes, a big disappointment. There were many reasons why I failed so badly. One group of them are mistakes that can be more generally applied to different races, which I will address in another video. In this video, I'm going to talk about the particularities of the terrain in the SwissPeaks 100 race course. The most important lesson I've learned is simple and comes in 2 words. Terrain matters. I sort of knew it matters before coming to the race, but I didn't truly know it does because I was always evaluating the difficulty of a course by looking at its steepness on the chart. When people say a certain section is not runnable, I would immediately think of the steepness as the chief reason why. From the course profile provided by the organizers of the SwissPeaks 100, my assumption was that the most difficult part of the race comes at the very beginning. The first 2 big climbs to Col de Fenestrale and Col des Magnies. And after the 3rd climb to Col de Soussanve, the highest point, everything would be like a walk in the park, just a rather long walk at that. Coming from Hong Kong, most of the trails here are artificially modified, with man-made stairs and stuff like that. There are of course some wilder trails not maintained by the government, like Sharp Peak in Sai Kung, Baogingshan, or the Greater Castle Peak area in Tuen Mun, but the trail running races in Hong Kong don't usually feature those. And even if they did, there would just be some short sections that are truly not runnable here and there. But on the race course of the SwissPeaks 100, there are no stairs whatsoever, no matter how steep the terrain is. The most runnable surface you have is like a traffic lane wide section with a layer of movable small rocks on it. That's it. At the start of the race, there comes the biggest climb from Finot to Col de Fenestral. I took my time on this part, which I thought would be the most difficult part, given the big climb, and the view was amazing everywhere you look, so I took some time to appreciate the landscape as a tourist rather than a runner in a race.
Barme, c'est dans
20 bornes.
That's the first climb, and the biggest one, I believe. And now we have a little bit of downhill in some quite technical terrain. The descent from Col de Fenestral truly shocked me. The downhill terrain was so rugged that you almost have no option but to track very carefully. Running fast is out of the question. The difficult terrain goes on continuously, with almost no respite. And the difficulty comes in many forms: loose rocks, narrow paths, wet slippery surfaces, and many others that I don't know how to describe. I imagine some people can run down this, but they must be very skilled and or very familiar with the route. Ça va. This kind of downhill section is very draining. You're going very slowly, your feet hurt as any small discomfort from your shoes gets magnified. You have to be mentally focused all the time. I would say this kind of downhill so-called running is exponentially more difficult than steep climbs, which is a matter of raw physical fitness. Of course, the downhill sections are not always like this in the race, but most of them include some sustained length of such technical terrain. At the end, it took me more than 4 hours to reach the first refueling station, or ravitaillement. At this point, I still thought what comes after in the race is going to be much easier, but I was wrong through and through. My lack of research on the details of the race course came up again and again over the race. For example, although I did read most of the words in the road book provided by the organizers, and knew that there are 3 types of aid stations that provide different foods and services, I simply assumed that every checkpoint with a time control on the chart is going to be an aid station. But look at it carefully, you'll see that at Susanf, after climbing the highest peak in the race, you have the only checkpoint that is not an aid station, as I assumed it was one at the first checkpoint, Auberge de Salanfe. I didn't eat nearly enough, thinking the next aid station was just 7.5 kilometers away. As someone who really dislikes energy gels, I simply ran out of energy after Col de Susanfe, and had to go very slowly through some arguably less challenging terrain. The lesson here is, don't make assumptions about unfamiliar races and research every single detail beforehand. When I reached the second aid station at Balm, almost 8 hours had already passed, and this was going to be just my second opportunity to eat in the race. And in contrast with most well-stocked aid stations in this race, the one at Balm was pretty minimal, which was very disappointing, although it had some packaged energy bars I could take away with. After Balm, with more than 60 kilometers to go, I knew I was not going to reach my sub-20 hour goal after all.
I'm fucking dying. I think my goal has become finishing the whole thing in 24 hours.
Although I was quite beaten up at this point and going very slowly, things are finally starting to look up. The landscape was still stunning, the terrain is becoming much less technical and much more runnable. Also, a guy from Belgium started to run with me just before reaching the next aid station. The chit chat with him definitely made the pain much less noticeable. The third aid station at Chamberlain had a much greater variety of food items and drinks. They actually had a machine to cut a block of delicious cured beef into thin slices. We stayed there for a bit to eat. And the next leg turned out to be by far the easiest leg of the race. After a short climb up the Porte de l'Hiver, it's all the way down, and apart from some short technical parts, the whole thing was pretty runnable for several kilometers. And the next aid station at Mojan was going to be the only life base which serves hot food and comes with showers and places to sleep, and also where you can get your drop bag. The very thought of it was definitely boosting morale.
Oh!
After unexpectedly spending a very long time, over 45 minutes in Mojan, changing t-shirts and socks and eating, I started out in the dark on my own. By this time, my Belgian friend has decided that he had had enough of paying for the day. At the live base, I also found that perhaps because of the technical downhill, my shoelaces actually tore through one of the lace holes, but I had only one pair of shoes, so I had to go with it.
I hope I'm not going to have to see sunrise tomorrow. But, it's not for me to say, right? And now I have kind of a broken shoe, so it's gonna be hard.
After leaving the town of Mojiang, I was completely in the dark, so I couldn't film anything. But the good thing was, now I could actually better focus on pushing myself to keep going. From Mojiang to the next aid station at Gonge, just over 6 kilometers away, I made my biggest gain in position, from 105th to the 80th overall. But after Gonge, the climb up to the Dong turned out to be extremely challenging. I was tired and sleepy. I actually went off the very well marked course for a bit, and perhaps I didn't eat enough or have enough electrolytes. I kept on drinking water. When I reached toward the Dong at the top, only 3 kilometers and less than 400 meters of elevation gain from Gonge, I finished up almost a liter of water, and that was in the night, so it wasn't hot, and I had only several sips left. When I was casually checking the profile chart at Gonge, I thought after Tour de Dong it's going to be all the way down to the next aid station at Chalet de Blancet, but no. The 10k or so has several climbs in it, totaling over 400 meters of elevation gain, and this was the toughest part of the race for me. I didn't have food, electrolytes, or water. I was moving extremely slowly and stopping to rest every several hundred steps. The even more devastating thing was, after 3.5 hours of struggling through the 10k and getting passed by so many people, I finally reached a house in the middle of nowhere, which I thought was the aid station Chalet de Blancet, but the house was completely dark. And there was a van parked there and a guy sleeping on the ground who seemed to be very disturbed by the runners passing through. I asked him in English, "Isn't this the aid station?" He responded in French, pointing to the race course that comes after. My French is very limited, but he ended his sentence with "à droite," which means to the right. So I assumed he was answering my question about the location of the aid station. So I kept going on a dirt trail for about a kilometer and reached a road. The SwissPeaks sign was on the left, but I turned right to try to find the aid station, but there was nothing. At this point, my several sips of water were long gone. Fortunately, there were still people passing me. I asked several of them the same question. Was there supposed to be an aid station? Some said no, some said there was supposed to be one, but they passed by that one. Some said yes. As I was forced to ask sometimes with my very limited French and got responses in French, I wasn't sure I got everything right. One guy who saw me struggling and offered to help assumed I was asking about the next aid station. He said it was 400 meters away. That thought kept me going. But at the end, it was the aid station at Dany. That was the next one after the one I was looking for. And it was actually around 2 to 3 kilometers away with a 300 meters climb in the middle. That was almost 18 kilometers from Gonge, and I was basically out of water or any supply in the dark for almost 5 hours. Later on, I found out that when I reached the very annoyed guy at the dark house, I had already passed by the missing aid station I was looking for at Chalet de Blancet. I spent quite some time at Dany to eat. The very nice people there served a kind of soup with mushrooms and they put it on bread. It was very delicious. And when I was eating, I was also thinking if I should give up or not. But my final decision was to keep going. First, dropping out in the middle of nowhere at Dany wasn't going to bring me any immediate comfort. Second, I actually thought Dany was the last aid station before the finish line, with one last bigger climb to Bas-de-Nouvenay, and it would be largely all downhill with just one small bump in the middle to the finish line. And at this point, I thought my new goal of finishing within 24 hours was actually reachable, as I had a bit more than 4 hours of time to cover around 20k, mostly downhill. How hard could it be? Fortified by the mushroom soup, I went much more smoothly on the 400 meters climb to Bas-de-Nouvenay, passing several slower runners. The downhill was fine initially, but then it turned into something unexpectedly difficult. You have to zigzag through a reef of rocks several times and so on, and the people I passed on the climb were catching up with me very quickly. And now I was starting to appreciate how much technique trail running can involve. And after a short climb up Col de la Croix, the difficult downhill turned nightmarish. It's a rather steep section, and the surface is just a layer of rolling rocks. The rocks are sliding down under your feet every step you make. For me, I had to make every step very carefully. But for the other, they were just running downhill, using their trekking poles or anchoring. On this downhill section, I basically got passed by everybody I passed on the previous climb and more. But after I struggled through this part of the downhill and started running, I found most of those who had been running on the sliding rocks were just walking on this very runnable part of the course. I still don't understand why. And now, it's actually dawn. The sun has come up, and it turned out that there was another aid station at Frenny, about 10k from the finish line. Looking at the profile chart, the rest of the course seemed very easy. A final climb of less than 200 meters and all the way down to Bouvray. But as per usual, the chart was deceptive. The initial section of the downhill from Onfried, or the top of the climb, was treacherous. You have this very narrow trail on a steep hillside going through the woods. The trail itself is not flat, and there are some sharp rocks in some parts. The soil under your feet is also soft. It doesn't feel firm at all. If you put your foot at the wrong spot, you might just lie down sideways into the steep hillside. So even though I really wanted the race to end soon, I had to track very slowly in this part. And again, for the runners, and indeed given that at this point it was 9 AM or so in the morning, there were some hikers on route already. Everything appeared so easy to them. I got passed by a bunch of people again, and I actually saw a young lady coming in the other direction who dressed like she's just out for a casual jog and who's typing frantically on her phone while going through this section. That's simply utter madness to me.
Another day.
Fortunately, after this short section of dangerous trail, the terrain becomes very runnable again. At this point, I was so beaten up that I could only do a run walk here. And finally, the buildings in Bouvray was clearly in sight. Salvation is near. For the rest of the race, 3 or 4 kilometers, I simply walked. Obviously, I couldn't make my 24 hours goal, but I was relieved that I could reach the finish line after so many long and lonely struggles. At the end, I have to admit that I didn't know that trail running or an ultramarathon could be something like this, with such varieties of challenging terrain, sustained challenging terrain, and adverse conditions. And now I can really appreciate the idea that trail running involves techniques, and the right techniques can help you go a long way. It's not just about physical fitness. As with any kind of suffering, looking back at these 25 hours now, I feel it was worth it. But I'm sure I didn't feel like that during those 25 hours. I can only hope after this bitter experience and utter failure, I could improve and become a better runner.